we sort of deluded ourselves that we could do almost everything. And we initially had probably a dozen groups, which we call task forces, dedicated to every conceivable approach, way to obtain a contraceptive effect. And I think that at least half of these methods, did not, in fact, work. One that was both controversial and high-tech was a vaccine, a pregnancy or an anti-pregnancy vaccine, which of course was also controversial. It never saw the light of the day, in spite of a lot of money, a lot of efforts. India, the United States were leading in the research in this field, but to my knowledge, almost 50 years later, nothing has come out.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the ECLJ YouTube channel. Today I'm presenting you with a new video with a very important yet little known person, Giuseppe Benagiano. He was a first-rank gynecologist and, most importantly, he's the former director of the Special Program of Research, Development and Training in Human Reproduction for the World Health Organization. The ECLJ reached out to him while working on this book, and he agreed to preface it and to give us an exclusive interview in 2023. This was a very long interview we did not originally intend to publish in its entirety. However, we believe that because the topic of demography and depopulation is so important, the full interview will be an enlightening contribution to the topic. Well, Giuseppe Benagiano is a key expert and witness of what the United Nations really founded and promoted over the last decades in the contraception and abortion field. Needless to say, we do not agree with everything he said in this interview, but we are convinced that his contribution will inform people on the human reproduction program that promoted contraception and abortion worldwide and influenced the world's demography. So we encourage you to listen to him and to read our publication on the history of the human reproduction program of the World Health Organization. The link to this publication is in the description below. Giuseppe Benagiano, thank you so much for accepting to do this interview with the ECLJ. I have a 9-page curriculum vitae for you, which is quite impressive. You were a professor and you were very much involved in the creation of the Human Reproduction Program, the HRP. Can you just briefly tell us what you have done for this, if you look back?
Well, we need to start with WHO, because this program was really created by WHO. And during the second half of the 20th century, there was a rapid evolution within the organization. Just to tell you the climate that existed in 1950 or in the 1950s, and it was 1951, the government of India requested the help of WHO to set up a system of natural family planning method, the so-called RIV method. The climate was so different that even this method that is approved by everyone created a big problem. And when WHO wanted to participate in the first World Conference on Population, a number of member state representatives said, if you dare to go to that, you, the Director General of WHO, if you dare to go to that conference, we will withdraw from WHO. Then, already by 1960, things started changing. The Director General started talking about family planning, even population control. And by 1970, the idea was to create a small unit leading and dealing with human reproduction. I joined that original small unit when in 1972 the decision was made to expand. That's the word that was used, the expanded program at the beginning, on research training in human reproduction.
Just getting back to you, you were a gynecologist. That was your motivation. You always wanted to be an obstetrician. And what motivated you to join the World Health Organization?
If you ask me how I became a gynecologist, honestly, I was in the last year of medicine and I had no idea what I would become. Then, during the practical exercise that you have to do as a medical student, I was not attending, but assisting at delivery. And that happened to be a cesarean section. And, you know, a cesarean section is in an operation theater. It looks like surgery. But then all of a sudden, a baby came out. And I was so impressed by this sort of miracle, if you wish, that I said, okay, that's what I want to be.
And so it's a miracle. It's beautiful. But back at the time in the 60s, there was this huge fear that the Earth would not be sufficient to face the growth of the population. Many knowledgeable people feared that. But if you look back, how do you interpret this fear? Do you think it did sense back in the days, or what do you think?
Well, you know, there is a very famous song, French, Je ne regrette rien. And this is exactly what I did. I'm sure we made mistakes. I'm sure we made faux pas. I'm sure not everything went as, actually, quite a few things didn't go the way we had hoped. But the trend was to help, especially the women and the women in the developing world, who had very little access to anything, including a minimum of personal decision making. So from the very beginning, there was also this other dimension that we were not only technology, but we were contributing to helping women in the world and especially in the developing world.
So that was the purpose, and you said you made mistakes. So what went well and what went wrong?
Well, you see, in many ways, we sort of deluded ourselves that we could do almost everything. And we initially had probably a dozen groups, which we call task forces, dedicated to every conceivable approach, way to obtain a contraceptive effect. And I think that at least half of these methods, did not, in fact, work. One that was both controversial and high-tech was a vaccine, a pregnancy or an anti-pregnancy vaccine, which of course was also controversial. It never saw the light of the day, in spite of a lot of money, a lot of efforts. India, the United States were leading in the research in this field, but to my knowledge, almost 50 years later, nothing has come out. So you see, if you want to look back, you see a number of avenues that were cul-de-sac.
Mm-hmm.
but others did, especially the long-acting methods. And I am proud, if you wish, to be the one who started the long-acting group. And today, the long-acting methods are becoming more and more important and more popular.
The Human Reproduction Program was created in 1972, especially with the leadership of Sweden, Canada, and Norway, and also the Ford Foundation. Would you say that it was only a handful of states which took care of or were concerned with population growth? And does that question the legitimacy of the HRP?
I don't think that what you say is totally correct, because, I mean, I was there.
Yeah.
It was the other way around. In other words, the initiative started with WHO. WHO counted very much on a professor from Sweden who happened to be my master, my mentor. And
what was his name?
His name was Egon Disfalushin. I trained in Sweden, among other countries, and so, and he convinced the Swedish Agency for International Development to give money to WHO, but it was WHO that started and said, would you like to give us money to do this and this? So the initiative was WHO, no one else. A small number of countries immediately responded, and the Ford Foundation, as a non-profit international organization, also provided the funds. The thing that probably is not clear in the minds of many people is that WHO never had the kind of money that was necessary to carry all the ideas, all the programs that WHO would have liked. So from the very beginning, the extra budgetary funds were probably as important as the ordinary, the quotations, not the quotation, but the payments by individual governments would give to WHO. And so without extra budgetary funds, nothing. There is another special program that became famous and successful, that on tropical diseases. And that too was totally funded outside of the organization. And the one thing that WHO insisted from day one was that whoever donated money would have to make a free donation. They couldn't say, we want you to spend it on this, that, and that. Mm-hmm. And up until when I left, which was in 1997, so more than 25 years ago, that rule was strictly enforced. I think it is enforced to this day, but of course I'm not 100% sure, but I think so.
So the WHO, the World Health Organization, started this project of doing something for the reproduction to reduce what was the first memory you have, or how did it start? WHO, there was the fund for the HRP. What happened?
As my granddaughter would say, in those days even I was young. And one of the characteristics of being young is to be enthusiastic, is to be confident that you could achieve something, that you could do something, in our case, for those who most needed it. And my recollection was that we, not me, all of us, perceive the work as something that would help women, especially in the underprivileged countries, to get a full spectrum, a full range of methods of family planning that suited their culture, their beliefs, and therefore helped them having the size of family that they really wanted. I have to also say that in many ways, and this is something that came later, but in many ways, technology was not sufficient because in a number of countries, all you have to do is to look at Afghanistan, Iran. I mean, in these countries, women have very little to say, sometimes zero. So we also realized that we had to talk to men. And I remember once talking to some American feminists, they said, this way you make men too important. I said, no, it's not me who makes men too important. They are. And what we want is to make them less important, less able to determine what the woman wants or doesn't want. So it was the other way around.
And so, in a way, the famous sentence adopted during the Cairo conference in 1994, according to which parents should have the right to have the desired number of children, is perfectly in line with HRP, would you say so?
What we did for Cairo is to propose a definition of reproductive health. And in that definition, it says that every couple has the right, and I would call it absolute right, to decide if, when, and how many children to have. So far from accepting the coercion that has been the characteristic of 70s, 80s, in some countries at least, we advocated, and the assembly, the Cairo Conference Assembly, accepted it fully, that family planning belongs to families, belongs to the men and women who make up the family, and not to governments, to other organizations. In that sense, I think that this is the best legacy that we could have left for the future.
And you spoke of freedom, but one famous country, China, had a one-child policy, which was very strongly enforced.
I have to say two things. The responsibilities for the health of people are with their government. WHO is not the Ministry of Health of the world. WHO works by agreement, by talking to countries and their representatives through the World Health Assembly, by making statements, by recommending things. But WHO's role is not to impose something. And so some countries in the 70s and 80s decided to go on their own. And China made this famous, somebody called it infamous, one-child family. India started a massive sterilization program. I think that in 1 year they sterilized 6 million people, mostly women, the way I remember. And, you know, By the way, the Chinese were able to really quench, and then they moved away from that, allowing 2 children and then 3 children. And apparently now the average family in China doesn't want to have the 3 children that, so to speak, they are permitted to have. So it's a very complicated and at the same time very delicate. Personally, I was very pleased when in 1994 the whole thing changed by agreement of the vast majority of the countries of the world, that coercion had to be, pushed out of the agenda everywhere.
Mm-hmm. But if to sterilize 6 million people in India, as you stated, did the Indian government use the HRP resources, or
the government of India could not have used HRP or WHO resources because we didn't have them.
Okay.
You see, this is another thing that, and I speak for my days, I don't know what has happened, but in my days, the WHO contribution was the salary of myself and 2 more people, and giving the premises. Every other penny came from outside.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say, but is this changing the game? Well, yes and no, as most of the time is the case. As I said, the money could not be labeled. Mm-hmm. We want you to do this. And for instance, for many years, the American government said, we will give you money, but you have to promise that not a single penny will go to any abortion program, even outside of your jurisdiction. And we said, no, we don't accept any label whatsoever. In my days, the money spent on abortion research was really minimal, and mostly as to prevent unsafe abortion, to the long-term consequences of abortion, unsafe abortion, and so on. So it was a very different situation than later. But we said no, because money had to be assigned. Now, having said that the money had to be without any label, the people who donated their money had something to say. There was a committee of those people, which is only natural. But another thing that people need to realize, HRP is not a WHO program. HRP is a UN program co-sponsored by UNDP, UNFPA, UNICEF, the World Bank, and WHO. But I don't know if I said them all. Yeah. And these other agencies are putting in money, whereas WHO, at least up to my days, didn't have any money to give. So whatever policy making existed and has to be agreed with the co-sponsors, who are on an equal foot with WHO. The program is located in WHO, is managed by WHO, but it's not owned by WHO. That to clarify the story. But, if you think that by receiving all this money, WHO privatized research or privatized program, I have to disagree, because again, if no extra budgetary money would have come to WHO, I don't know of any program that could have, even when the HIV program started, it was necessary to get money from outside. Then eventually, as you know, the HIV became a separate program. And it got its donation because the UN cannot function without government or other agencies' donation. And I don't think it's anything wrong as long as the people who donate cannot say, I give you this, but you have to spend it this way. And, having said that, the fact remains that if you donate money, one way or the other, you have something to say. You are part of the decision making. And if the money comes from government organizations, foundations, who have a certain philosophy of life, then the program eventually will be moved in that direction. It's inevitable.
Exactly.
However, personally, I would rather blame the governments who refuse to give any money, because if they did the same, they would have the same voice and they could move the program in any direction that conceivable that they would wish. And personally, during my days as director, I went to, I don't remember how many of these critical because they were critical of the program, and said, come in, give us money, and you will sit in the committees and you will tell us what to do. I failed miserably. Not one of those critical governments gave a penny. I don't remember any, strong opposition or because we never forced anyone. We never said you need to do this or that, to use this or not to use this. We were at the level of making the methods available, prove that they were safe. That was another very important and probably the most successful part of our work. Determine the duration of action, for instance, of all the IUDs, so or the implants or whatever. So I feel confident that we did not offend anyone.
Recently, the World Health Organization published the abortion care guideline in 2022. This is with support and the help of the HRP and the UNFPA. And this document clearly supports abortion and recommends to states to offer or to provide abortion whatever the pregnancy is, so up until birth. And there are a couple of recommendations that are based on science, because it concerns the amount of progesterones and so on. But there are also a couple of recommendations that are clearly driven by pro-abortion speech. That is yes, states should authorize abortion because it is about women's rights. And so here we clearly are outside of the scope of the... What do you say?
I am out of everything, and so I can tell you what I think. And I have a position that probably will find unanimity of disapproval, because I am neither pro-choice or pro-life. And I tell you why. I consider abortion an intrinsically negative act because it eliminates human life. And I say life, I don't say human being, human individual, just life. And it's difficult to deny that that's life and that's human. So I don't think that there is or there can be a human right to abortion. Having said that, I am totally in favor of having abortion legal. And this is for two reasons. The first and probably most important is that making abortion illegal doesn't decrease the number of abortions. And there has been a very impressive study that focused on Romania. Romania was a country of totally free abortion until Ceausescu decided that he was like Mussolini, he needed a lot of people for whatever purpose. And so he made abortion totally illegal. And the statistics showed that the number of pregnancies of children born went up, obviously, if you don't abort them. And it went up to a certain level and then stabilized it. And over 3 or 4 years, it went back to where it was. And anybody can explain that in the way they want, but definitely it means that abortions of Romanian women went back to what they were when it was totally free. Mm. So I personally don't think that abortion, making abortion illegal is decreasing their number. What making abortion illegal does is increasing the risk, because probably not so much in the developed world, but in the developed world, the vast majority of countries have a legal abortion policy, more or less restricted, but legal. And so the illegal abortions are in the poor countries. And there, a botched abortion may take the life of the woman. And I remember as a young doctor, when I was actively working in the delivery room in Rome and abortion was still illegal, I saw a woman coming in and she had a rubber tubing all the way inside that it had perforated the uterus. And when she arrived, she had a terrible sepsis. And in spite of everything we did, the woman died, denying to ever have had an abortion. So I, even though I was working in Italy, I did see the consequences of illegal abortion. And so you understand that whereas there shouldn't be an unlimited abortion, also because when you go down that road, then you abort fetuses which or who would survive In other words, if you go beyond the end of the 6th month, technology is such that you can save those lives of the early bit. And so if you use the word abortion, which by definition is before the fetus is viable, and so one group in Australia a few years ago, and with some friends, we wrote a very strong article opposing it. We're talking about after-birth abortion, and we called it a scientific abomination because abortion is for the word abortion is only for pregnancies where the product of conception is not viable. And then the idea of killing, then infanticide should be also made. And you know that millions over the years and the years, probably billion infanticides have been committed mostly of baby girls.
Just getting back to what you said regarding the states that you encouraged to found the HRP, not to complain, but to give money and to have a voice. Do you remember any state or foundation insisting on giving money and to allocate the money to a special project? I just mentioned the
not in
mission.
my days, because it was such a clear. I don't remember anyone coming to me and say, look, you are the director, here is money. We could, in those days, I'm not saying anything about today because I'm not involved, I have no role, and therefore I have nothing to say about it. But in my days, we felt if people want to conduct ethical research and find out whether a product does or does not harm users, why not? But we need to be able to publish the results, whatever they may be.
Yeah, that's
so that's the borderline or the limiting factor.
Yeah. And I wanted to get back also to the task force you mentioned. Can you describe very concretely how the HRP used to work when you were there? So basically you were looking for methods of contraception. So you had different options.
We had, I think, about 10 different groups, which we call task forces. Mm-hmm. They were dedicated to one aspect. I mentioned the vaccine against pregnancy. I started working on natural family planning method. Then I concentrated on long-acting contraceptives, injections every 3 months or implants for years. Now those implants last years. You put it under your arm and it goes on for years. There was another task force that I was involved, and it had to do with blocking the migration of sperm. In other words, you could have your sexual act, and then the sperm would be prevented from reaching the uterus and therefore to have fertilization. After a number of years, that group was dismantled because we got nowhere. We had a task force on social aspects, research, not action, because action was not part of our original scope. So we covered probably there was one called postcoital, which is what people call the morning after pill or emergency contraception. And on that particular area, there have been a number of improvements, if you wish, but also a lot of work on the mechanism of action to come up with basically the conclusion that they don't prevent implantation. But there is also another aspect that the first 2 weeks after fertilization, before the implantation is completed, you have a situation which is completely different than what happens after the 2 weeks. During those first 2 weeks, it is difficult to have a exact figure, but there are probably 15 different works using different methodology that show that at least 50% of the fertilized oocytes do not proceed to implantation. And so in the human, the very early embryo, pre-embryo, use the word that you want, loss, natural, is minimum 50%. So to try to do something in those 2 weeks would be terrible because it's Mother Nature. Let me use a word that I use only technically, but we, the humans, are a bunch of bastards. Some of us are also bastards in the common sense, but we are bastards because we don't have any pure race. And on top of it, we don't want that. We want mixing, and the genome moves around and changes all the time. That also carries the lethal mutations and is causing errors that don't exist in some or many animal species. So Mother Nature has organized itself so that it has an incredibly clever mechanism to identify those very early embryos or pre-embryos that are okay and are allowed to be implanted, whereas all the others are eliminated. Eliminated naturally, and in the majority of cases, the pregnant woman doesn't even know that she is pregnant. It happens before the first missed period. So whatever happens in that period, in my opinion, can never be called an abortion. It's an abomination to call it an abortion. After full implantation, then yes, it is an early abortion, whatever you want to call it. And if we don't make this separation and we don't allow, which in Europe is being allowed everywhere, including the Southern European countries, for the so-called morning after pill, and there are 2 or 3 different methods, and they work. And so it's another way to prevent abortion, but you have to start from the premise that that is not an abortion in itself.
The HRP tried to get a vaccine to sterilize people, but you said it never worked.
No, the vaccine would interrupt the pregnancy, not even the gestation. So the vaccine
would prevent.
You could call it an abortion vaccine.
Okay.
if you use the words correctly, because it would, the way that pregnancy starts or gestation starts is extremely complex, as you may imagine. But the most famous substance that allows pregnancy to move on is called chorionic gonadotrophin. HCG is the acronym. The vaccine was against that molecule, against one part, but against that molecule. And so that molecule rises with implantation, around implantation, until the vaccine is actually tested. I cannot tell you whether it starts to be effective at the beginning of the implantation process, after the implantation process has been completed. But for sure, it targets the substance that allows pregnancy to move on. So,
and so it was tested but ineffective?
Look, it doesn't exist, and it shouldn't bother anyone, because as far as I know, nobody talks about it anymore that I know. After 30, 40 years, the whole thing has been abandoned, as far as I know. I didn't follow this field over the last several years, but I don't.
So the very last question, a philosophical one. In an article published in 1995 with Egon Disfalucci from Hungary, you place the HRP in the lineage starting with Condorcet and then Malthus and ending with Margaret Sanger. What's your, now that you've left and...
What we meant, well, I don't want to go back to what I meant 20 odd years ago. But the point is, the move to limit population growth is not new. And very few people know that one of the fathers of the, I say Christian, not Catholic, because he was from the 7th century, so before either the Orthodox separation or the Western Protestant movement, Saint John from Damascus, the Bishop of Damascus, he said the world is overpopulated and we cannot have this thing continue. This was in the 7th world. I don't know how many people there were at that time on Earth, a few 100 million. So the idea is old. Then you mentioned Condorcet, and then all the others. I would add Adams, the economist, who was also reasoning on the resources of the world that are limited, that don't grow the way the greed of humans grows. And then everybody knows Malthus. That's 220 years ago, more or less. But not everyone knows that Malthus was opposed to contraception and abortion. So his view of population control was, shall I say, very classic. Infant mortality, wars, pestilence, which has been what the situation in fact was for millennia. The population didn't grow because of those things, but I wouldn't advocate them as methods of. So as soon as those were eliminated at the end of the 19th century, the population growth started. And the growth rate peaked around 1950, 1955. And it is at that time that finally the world, meaning the governments, meaning WHO, meaning the UN, started saying, hey, we got to do something. Because it's obvious that we cannot have 20, 30, 40 billion. And I remember the UN Office of Population projections. I had a slide, the old type, in cellophane, that showed the projections made in 1990 for the year 2100 or 2150. And they made 4 different projections wisely. And one, the top, predicted 30 billion humans on Earth by the year 2100. Some, I don't know, I think 25 years later, the same organism made a projection, and the highest projection was 10 billion people lower than the one on 1990. So things have changed so rapidly that even the demographers were baffled because they had not predicted what had happened. And we are now in a situation where the same people, but probably not the same individual, but the same organization, is projecting that in the year 2100, the population of the world would be basically like the one of 2020 now. Yeah. So it will go up a little bit to probably 250, 2050, and then go back to what we have today in 2100. I don't have a crystal ball. For sure I won't be there, and so it's not my problem.
But do you think that the HRP has a role in this result?
Look, I hope it did. I spent a total of, I think, 13 years in two separate times, in 72 to 81 and 93 to 97, working there. I followed it even later, doing whatever I could. So obviously I am biased. I am biased in favor, but even creating awareness is a goal and can be considered a positive outcome, which I think we did.
Thank you so much.